So I did the math, well, I counted actually. Since 2007, Marvel has put out over 30 superhero movies, plus a ton of TV shows. DC has put out over 15 movies, plus a few shows as well on the CW and other channels on HBO, things like that. So bottom line, that's a lot of superheroes, folks, over the last 15 years. And honestly, it started before that. I'd say probably the early 2000s is when superhero movies started to pick up steam with the likes of X-Men and Spiderman and a few other movies. And honestly, they all pretty much owe their success to about 10 years prior when we had a boom period of superhero cartoons. Now, superhero cartoons have been around a lot longer than the 1990s. They date back all the way to the 1960s. 60s, I think. But I mean, the 90s, there was something special about those Marvel and DC characters in the 90s to the point where a lot of the movies that came out were essentially modeling themselves after the shows from the 1990s. So today, Lou and I are talking about superhero cartoons from the 1990s, some of our favorites. We're going to definitely have some good honorable mentions in there as well, because there was a lot of superhero cartoons in the 1990s, and all of the stuff you see today owes itself to what you saw on the screen back in the mid-1990s. So this was an episode that we recorded a little while back. Please enjoy our discussion on superhero cartoons of the 90s on Generation S.
What is it?
It's time to go back.
Welcome.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Generation S. It's a podcast about growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. I'm your host, Dan Kemp, along with my co-host, the returning Lou Carnivale.
Good to be back. Good to be back.
And very excited about this episode. Almost a continuation of one of the episodes that you and I did a while back, which was about the Power Rangers and how we kind of grew up with a franchise. We started with Ghostbusters, worked our way into Ninja Turtles, and then Power Rangers. And today we're talking about a few shows that really kind of monopolized our lives after that. Talking about superhero cartoons from the 90s. More specifically, we're talking about superhero cartoons that would air on Fox. So Lou, I mean, we have our show notes here. We have the same three shows that we're going to talk about. So let's just go ahead and get them out of the way. So, we've got, X-Men, the animated series. We've got Spiderman, the animated series. And then over on the DC side, we've got Batman, the animated series.
Yeah, we do. The thing is, this was my first introduction into superheroes. I didn't have comics growing up, so this is how I got into them. And then you were talking about that timeline of Ghostbusters, Turtles, Power Rangers. This was it. This was like the kind of finale of like the kid shows, kid-natured shows, things of that nature. Because after this, it was sports, professional wrestling, things of that nature. So this, to me, is the end of like that innocent age, so to speak.
The animated era of childhood.
Yeah, I mean, Power Rangers weren't animated, but yeah, they
that's
could have been.
That's a good point.
Of like that genre. It's like the end of that era where you're watching the show because there's money to be made by the makers of it, and to go buy the toys and buy the VHS and buy the video games, and that was the end goal of these shows. At the end of the day, was obviously to make money, but as a kid, there was more to just watching the shows.
Right. Well, and this was one of the last set of shows. And again, these, there was a few shows, but these were kind of like you. This is what got me into superheroes. I had heard of some of the superheroes. I probably had some of the toys that were like hand-me-downs or garage sale buys from like the 80s where, they weren't as popular. I knew who Batman was, obviously, because of the movies. Spider-Man, I'd heard of. I'd seen him. I had never... never read any comics. I know there were other Spider-Man cartoons before the 90s one, but I never watched him. X-Men, honestly, that was probably, I got to say that the cartoon was the reason I know anything about the X-Men. So very similar to you in that vein. But yeah, very much the end of an era, so to speak, where, it was. Now, I there were other kid shows that I would watch after this, but this was, again, like kind of like you said, these were the toy commercial companies where like you had to have the toys because you were watching these shows. So we're going to do things a little differently today. Normally on these types of episodes, we kind of go through our memories and then we talk about like the toys and then the show and then if there are movies, that type of thing. This is going to be a little different. We're going to break it down by the 3 different shows. So we're going to start by talking about X-Men. We're going to move on to Spider-Man and wrap things up with Batman. And then maybe talk about a few other kind of honorable mentions. But before we do that, I want to ask your opinion on this. Not an opinion, but more so if you did this as a kid. So when I was a kid, on the playground, we would always do like a who would beat who in a fight, and it was superheroes usually, but it was like, you know, who would win between Batman and Spider-Man or Wolverine and Iron Man or whatever. Did you do that type of stuff on the playground or with your friends?
Yeah, we definitely did that. We did that with superheroes. We also did that with video games, which sounds a little weird.
So what do you mean by that? Give me an example.
Mario and Sonic, if they were to fight, who would...
Okay, so like who was better?
Yeah,
okay.
we did Mario and Sonic, probably Yoshi and Tails or something like that. When we got a little bit older, I think I've mentioned it before on the show. I was a big fan of the Twisted Metal series of games for PS1. The characters changed in each game, so what cars were better from each game. Another one was Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. So those were things that we discussed. But yeah, we did that with the Marvel and the DC.
A lot of verses. Yeah. Well, so let me ask you. So watching these shows, I can't remember, honestly, myself, if I knew the difference between Marvel and DC as far as comic books. Like, when you watch these shows, did you know the difference between, like, you knew that Batman and Spider-Man would never really appear in the same show or comic book for the most part because it was 2 totally separate companies. Did you have any kind of cognition of that at this age?
I did. Not so much on the Marvel side. I didn't really know the Avengers, so to speak, but I did know the Justice League. I did know Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman. Like, to me, regardless of your age, if you were a boy in the 90s, they were there. Those 3.
But did you know they were separate from Marvel? Like, you knew that they were totally different companies that made them?
Yeah, I did. I did know that there was 2 sets of comics, so to speak. There was Marvel and there was DC, and DC had their guys and Marvel had their guys. Similar to like a baseball team. That's how I viewed it. Okay. Same thing with like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. There were Street Fighter guys, there was Mortal Kombat guys. There was Batman had his guys that he teamed up with, and then Marvel, I didn't realize how big Marvel was until like the toys. When I started to see the toys, like they were marketed, like they had the Punisher had his own line of figures, then the X-Men had their line of figures. Like, oh, but they're like the same size. Like the box art looks the same, and oh wait, they're on the same cartoon. So that's when I started to piece together the Marvel stuff.
Well, and what's cool, again, you mentioned the Avengers, because listen, man, unless you were a comic book nerd in the 90s, which we were not, you didn't know really who the Avengers were. Like, it's so different now, almost 25 years later, like, where that's huge that you got the Marvel Cinematic Universe, whereas, back in the day, man, you didn't have that. You had, again, if you knew the comics, you knew that Spider-Man would hang out with Captain America or Iron Man or whatever. That was like, but you didn't know that as far as like the mainstream.
They were like B-list superheroes too.
Well, and that's the thing too. Yeah, so all these superheroes, and we'll get to them because a few of them had shows back then, but not a lot, and for good reason, because nobody really cared about them. But it was a situation where you didn't really have a blended universe like you do now, or did you? And we'll get to that in a second, because we're going to start with the 2 Marvel shows and talk about how they've kind of crossed over a little bit. I guess let's get into it then. So we'll start with X-Men, and I'd say of the 3 shows, this is probably out of 3, with number 1 being the best and number 3 being the still really great, but not as much favorite, we'll say. I think X-Men's, for me, going to be right in the middle. It's going to come in at number 2.
Really? I thought that was your number 1.
No, honestly, spoiler alert, Batman, my number 1, hands down, just because I've always loved Batman. But X-Men is a strong number 2, as far as like just really good show, really enjoyed watching it, and really was always into the X-Men, even more probably than Spider-Man back in the day.
So you're saying number 2 as a kid it was your number 2, or looking back now it's your number 2?
I'd say both, honestly. I mean, I think I always looked forward to watching Batman more than X-Men, even back then. And again, it's hard because I could say all three are tied because they're all really great and I loved them all pretty much equally. And let's be, let's not forget these three are still a cut above all the other superhero cartoons that were out there at the
in
time.
my opinion, not even close.
Not even close. Yeah, so I mean, they're very close for the top three spots here. So, but if I had to rank them, I'd probably put X-Men right in the middle in terms of just the enjoyment of it. And again, as an adult, it's a show that really holds up. I'd say all three of these really do hold up as an adult. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it. So X-Men, honestly, I can't remember the first episode I watched. It was one of those where it started showing up on TV, so I started watching it. But what about you? Do you remember when you first saw it or anything like that?
X-Men, I don't. You mentioned Spider-Man. I do remember that, and I know we'll get to that, but that's the only one I do remember is Spider-Man. But X-Men, I don't remember. I remember how I got into it. A friend had a lot of the toys. And he had the jet. Is it the Blackbird?
Blackbird, yep.
Blackbird jet. Between the toys and the games were not good. That's what got me into it. Can't pinpoint it, but it was definitely through a friend.
So for me, it was... Again, I don't remember when I watched the show, but I remember I started watching it, and it was probably second or third grade where that was on the playground where, the same discussions around like who would beat who in a fight. X-Men was great because you had so many different characters to choose from, kind of like the Power Rangers where like each kid could be a different mutant or X-Men or whatever to play. And so that was awesome. And I think my favorite back then was always Wolverine. I mean,
I think everybody liked Wolverine back then.
I feel like that's kind of a cop-out answer because everyone likes Wolverine. What about you? Who was your favorite X-Men?
Back then, I think it was Cyclops. I think the fact that he could shoot laser beams out of his eye was pretty cool.
Okay. I mean, and again, they were all pretty cool. I do remember there was a Sega game that where you could choose from 4 different characters, and it was Wolverine, who I always picked, Cyclops, Gambit.
Remember Gambit.
You got Gambit, and then you got Nightcrawler.
Was that the Clone Wars game?
It was the first one. So Clone Wars was the second Sega Genesis game. This was just called X-Men.
Okay, no relation to Star Wars, of course. The Clone Wars.
No, of course not. Not at all. But I digress. Super fun Sega game. And again, I was playing that game while I was watching the show, so there's a lot of parallels there. I honestly, it's funny because I had some of the X-Men toys, but honestly, as far as like the Marvel superhero shows, I didn't really have that many compared to Spider-Man, which again, we're going to talk about in a minute. But I didn't have as many of the toys. So honestly, I'd say between the show and video games is where I had most of my exposure. And then, of course, playing with friends and pretending to be X-Men, and then of course the movies came out a few years later. And I'll be honest, I don't think those movies would have existed had it not been for the success of the 90s cartoon.
I agree. Two things I agree with. The movie, like you said, I think that came out of our love of X-Men was why it was able to be made. Those early 2000s movies. And then I was the same way. I didn't have a lot of the X-Men toys. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, the first figure I remember getting was a Cyclops figure, but it wasn't that, do I say iconic? Because some people don't like it. The blue and yellow from the TV show.
I mean, that's like his main outfit.
But do you like those outfits? I mean, it's funny. You just mentioned the movies. They make fun of those outfits in the movies when they give Wolverine the suit.
I mean, to me, when I picture the X-Men in my head, the 90s cartoon X-Men, which were also how they looked in the comics during that time period, that to me is and everyone has their, for different comic book characters, their definitive look. That is their definitive look for me, and they've certainly changed since then in the comics, and they've had other cartoons since then, but to me, that is the definitive look for them.
I agree. But the Cyclops figure I had was the blue suit with like white stripes on it, and he had it was like a one-piece. So
you had the 80s Cyclops
and he had a
figure.
button on the back, and his his eyes lit up. So I had that.
You want to know something crazy? So that exact action figure is sitting in my son's toy box upstairs right now.
Like a remake of it,
wasn't,
or like that actual one?
Like from the
Really?
80s. Yeah, I think so. My parents, they went to a garage sale. This was probably last year, and they said, "Hey, we found a bunch of action figures. Do you think Eli would want some?" And I said, "Yeah, man, he loves action figures." Sent up a whole bucket full of them, and including not only that Cyclops, but also one from the '90s. Who, it's funny, because I think this happened in the comics too. Back in the '80s, I mean, you had pretty fit looking superheroes, but the 90s, man, I mean, they just went up, they basically got on steroids, right? They were huge, but the action figures were the same way. So we have 80s Cyclops where he's got the full kind of hooded outfit going on, and he looks to be in shape, but he's slim, right? You got 90s Cyclops. I'm holding them side by side. And this dude's freaking beefy. Yeah. I mean, like night and day. Like he's probably for scale, he's probably like 2 inches taller. Really, he's probably about a half centimeter taller. But he's just big, and he's like it's like Van Damme versus Schwarzenegger in terms of body proportions. So anyway, I just thought that was funny that by the 90s things just got really roided up when it comes to
absolutely.
action figures.
And the worst was the Supermans. The Superman figures legitimately looked like he was built like just. I mean,
there's like the Hulk.
Yeah, like. All the everything in media that was supposed to be looked at as a superhero on TV, like the figures,
just muscles on muscles on muscles,
muscles in the figures, muscles on the TV, muscles on your sports figures. Like Hulk Hogan had muscles, the toys had muscles of Superman. Mark McGuire had muscles on top of muscles. It was just everywhere, absolutely everywhere.
It was the time, man, and. Well, and that's probably a topic for another show, but I mean, honestly, that whole era of just you have to be big and huge. I mean, I think we're coming down from that a little bit because we're seeing like that's really not a healthy way to look. But it's not, it's still, I think, very prevalent in today's society. And I think people that grew up when we did especially still have those issues where they look in the mirror going, man, I wish I looked like that. I wish I could look like, The Rock or Stone Cold Steve, whatever. Brother. Stone Cold Steve Austin didn't have much of a butt, or Hulk Hogan. Exactly. So I think myself included, to be honest with you, I'll look at myself in the mirror and listen, I'm in some kind of shape. I'm in a shape, as my wife says, it's not a dad bod, it's a father figure. But I look at myself in the mirror going, man, I just wish I could have looked like Hulk Hogan or whatever. But it's unrealistic expectations is my point.
Everybody has it. And I'm sure the girls that are a little bit younger than us have that with the Kardashians.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So anyway, that was a big tangent. Let's jump back into it. So we're talking about the toys.
We're talking about X-Men toys, and Kim Kardashian just came out of my mouth. How did that happen?
And body dysmorphia and the Kardashians,
we're talking
ladies
about
and gentlemen.
Toys and the Kardashians. Yes. What do they have in common, Dan?
They're both made of plastic.
Bingo! And we did not rehearse that.
Nope. Anyway, all right, man. So I don't want to go into a super deep dive on the series itself, but I mean, it lasted for 5. You actually did some research and wrote this down, so thank you. 5 seasons, 75 episodes between 92 and 97. Again, just a great show. One thing I want to talk about, again, the episodes in general. What I liked about X-Men is that there was kind of some overarching storylines between episodes, whereas some cartoons, you could watch them in any order and really not gain or lose anything from it. Whereas X-Men, you could still enjoy random episodes, but you really got rewarded because you had an episode, and then the next episode would reference something that would happen in the previous episode. In fact, I believe most of the time at the start of the episode, you would hear Cyclops go, previously on X-Men, and then he would talk about the previous episode. So it was almost like an early version of kind of like binging a show because it had that continuity that you didn't see a lot in animated series.
Yes, and if you recall back one of my issues with Ghostbusters, even as a younger kid, because this is mid to late 90s with X-Men, early 90s with Ghostbusters, it was just, I know they're going to finish this up in 22 minutes. Like, there's nothing that's going to happen. There was never that, oh, this is really bad and something's going to happen. Turtles did it a few times. Power Rangers did it a little bit more, but the X-Men was like, it was sometimes half the season was one story arc.
Well, and I think that's what was really great is that it was like a comic book, right? So we didn't read comic books, but this is the same feeling you would get if you were into comic books of having like, that payoff after reading 4 or 5 issues of like, okay, this big story is going to wrap up in this issue and we're going to get something teased for the next story arc at the end of this. The cartoon kind of did it paralleled that in a lot of ways.
It certainly did, and it was loyal to the source material. A lot of shows of that era, before that era, would just take the characters, put their own twist on it, and off they go. Kind of like the Gotham show that's out. Now it's not out now, but it has been out in the last 4 or 5 years. That's not.
You're talking about that live action kind of prequel to Batman.
Live action Batman show, Gotham, which actually doesn't have Batman in it. I call it CSI Gotham.
Okay,
but they're taking the characters and they're just putting their own twist on it. So it's they're there. Penguin's there. Ivy's there. Mr. Freeze is there. The similarities are there, but it's not the source material. The X-Men, actually, I don't want to say Batman, but X-Men and Spider-Man on the Marvel side was literally take the comic, make it a show. That's it. And I mean, the comics sold well. Why wouldn't the show do well? And they both did very well, both shows.
Yeah. So well, in fact, that X-Men is actually the animated series, because they've had animated series since then, but they're actually bringing back this version of X-Men on Disney Plus, and I think it's coming out sometime in 2023, maybe?
I think so. I think it's about a year.
I haven't kept up. But they're calling it X-Men 97 because that was the last year that this show aired, and so they're continuing by calling it X-Men 97, and I've seen some still images from it, and I got to tell you, it looks like the show from back in the day, just, I'd say, I don't know, more like cleaned up, like better looking because it's HD, and it's made with, it's probably computer animated, so it's going to look a little smoother, I would think.
Yeah, and I'm excited for it because it's not a reboot. It's, like you said, it's a continuation, which is great. They also made a comic called X-Men 92, which is, I guess, like lost stories or just things that got cut from the show. So I actually have one of those comics. Jubilee is on the cover of it out of all the characters. Yeah, Sparkles, Tingles, whatever you want to call her.
What was her power, man?
Fireworks.
I mean, she shot fireworks. That's literally her. Okay, so she literally, like, in, like, half of the states in the South where I live would be perfectly like, yep, she got fireworks, man. That's cool.
Yes, and in New York, be like, oh, you can do anything you want in Manhattan, but don't you dare have fireworks. And as the fireworks go off in the 4th of July, everybody's like, who cares?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, she was, I think, just for the show, but there's some lasting power because she was on the cover of the comic. She's going to be in the 97, not reboot, continuation of the show. Yeah. So I think it was such a great show. And what about that theme song?
Okay, and I was going to mention this too. Literally, I was like ready to say that because we have talked about several franchises up until now. Turtles, Power Rangers. What did they all have in common?
Great
banger theme songs.
Great theme songs. You know what would be a great idea? A top 10 list.
Of like animated
or
theme
just
songs?
90s theme songs.
Like to any show. All right. That's I'm writing this down. That's going to be, I'm going to put a pin in that because definitely planning on having some spin-off episodes where we go through top 10 lists of different things, and I think one of them absolutely should be 90s TV show theme songs.
You're acting like I just teed you up a baseball right there. That's another.
It was so organic.
It was just like our Kardashians and plastic action figure thing was. So yes,
that was incredible.
But that theme song is fantastic.
Oh my god, incredible! I'll still put it on. Like, so I found a version that's like a heavy metal cover of the dun 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 dun. Like, literally will get me so pumped up, man. I love that song so much.
It's fantastic. I would also suggest going on YouTube and watching the Japanese intro. Have you ever seen it for the show?
No, so they had a separate intro for the Japanese
when we're
version?
done with this, you have to go and watch that.
Okay.
Okay, so the theme song by itself gets your adrenaline going. If you watch this intro on mute, the intro will get you pumped up. Then combine both of it, and you're going to be like, listen, I'm just going to go flip over a car.
In a good way.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh my god. All right, well listen, before we get to Spider-Man, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and it'll tie into Spider-Man. You'll see what I'm saying. Is I want to talk about the Phoenix Saga.
Oh yes.
So much like our previous episode on Power Rangers where we talked about the Green Ranger saga, X-Men is, I mean, I'd say of all the episodes from that, that series, I gotta say the Phoenix Saga is probably the most well-known, to the point where they've adapted it into film not once, but twice.
They both stunk!
And they were both terrible, but that's beside the point. The point is, this mini-series was so talked about. This was one that, like, on the playground, we would debate about what would happen in the next episode, because I think it was like 4 or 5 parts.
I think it was even longer. Do I have the DVD? Hold on. Because as I'm doing this, I'm literally looking at the back of my DVD holder, like the side of it is open, so I could see the box art on the back of it. And
right.
Top DVD is the Spider-Man movie, the newest one. Underneath it is, on the second row, is Batman the Animated Series. And underneath that is Turtles Complete Collection. So I'm just going to take a peek here. And I actually am looking.
Yeah, I know. You're stepped away from the microphone.
No, I don't have the X-Men animated, but I want to say it was half the season.
I mean, it was a pretty significant portion.
It was, because I remember getting the DVD sets and disc 1, because on the back of the box art, they had disc 1, and they listed all the episodes in disc 2 in 2 separate boxes. Don't ask me why I remember this. Ask me what I had for dinner last night. No idea, but I remember this. And then the top box was all Phoenix Saga. So I want to say it was like maybe 7 or 8 episodes. It was long.
I mean, it was definitely their most well-known, like, storyline. I mean, at least up until this point, either in the comics, maybe not. I don't know about the comics because I didn't follow the comics, but definitely in the cartoon. Like, it's hands down the fact that it's the only one that I remember at this point as far as like an ongoing one. So anyway, the reason I bring that one up is because in Spider-Man there was another mini-series. Not a mini-series, sorry, a saga, like a group of episodes that was kind of stitched together. And again, my favorite of the entire Spider-Man animated series. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about Spider-Man because unlike X-Men, I remember when I watched the show, and I remember the first episode I watched. I was in second or third grade, and it was the episode with the Hobgoblin. And I thought this Hobgoblin guy was going to be a big deal. He has not showed up anywhere else other than maybe some of the other comic books and animated series. But what about you? What do you have any early memories of or I think you mentioned that not so much this one, or this was the only one that you remember when you first watched it.
Yeah, I remember watching an episode with Doc Ock. It was one of the first things I watched.
And so this show came out in 94, so it was 2 years after X-Men. And what's cool about this one is, again, before we had the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we had the Marvel Animated Universe, the MAU, or we're going to call it MAW. It had the MAW, right? And so because Spider-Man would have appearances from other Marvel superheroes, including the X-Men. And what was really cool is that they were voiced by the same voice actors as the X-Men animated series. So it truly made it feel like it was all set in the same universe, which, again, super huge. I don't think I appreciated it for what it was until I saw it done again in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Hold on 1 second. Can you stop, please?
Okay.
Okay, but I asked you not to. Like, I'm trying to concentrate. Like, you've opened the refrigerator like 5 times. Please stop. Sorry about that. So
You're
what
good.
did we leave off?
So the last thing I said was it truly made it feel like a Marvel cinema. I didn't appreciate the continuity that they did until I saw it done again in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
All right, ready to go?
Yep.
So what blew my mind was just the intro, because it had the Punisher in it. And I didn't know much about the Punisher, but I knew he was in Marvel. I knew he was a hero. But just watching that, I go, why is he in the intro? Like, he's not Spider-Man. He's not affiliated with Spider-Man. So that, just the intro, every single time you watch the show, got me interested in going, well, is he in this episode? Is this the time? Is it going to be somebody else? Who else is going to show up on this? So that had me intrigued from day one.
Well, and it's funny, going back to X-Men just for a minute, you had hints of other non-X-Men characters. Like I think in one episode there was like they showed a flash of Deadpool. I want to say maybe Iron Man was in there one as well. But you had these other X-Men characters, but they didn't really have anything to do with the story. It was just like a quick little, almost like an homage or an Easter egg. Whereas Spider-Man's honestly, the animated series of Spider-Man is the only reason I knew about Daredevil or the Fantastic Four or Iron Man. Like I learned about them from the Spider-Man show. So Spider-Man was almost kind of like the new Spider-Man movie where he brought in all the different universes. This was almost like he was the character that brought all the Marvel superheroes together and made me realize that they were all hanging out in the same place, and it was all, in the same, again, going back to the word universe over and over again, but going back to that same universe, the Marvel animated universe. And so I thought that was really awesome.
It was very smart. It's similar to what Disney's doing right now with Star Wars. Not going to go too deep into it, but the live action Star Wars shows, you had The Mandalorian, but then they introduced Ahsoka, and then they introduced Luke Skywalker again, and they did this, and Boba Fett, blah, 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 blah. They're introducing these characters in one show that they know is proven to be popular and taking it from there. So like you said, yeah, that's how I saw Iron Man and Fantastic Four. I didn't watch those shows, but I at least knew who they were.
Yep. And so going back to the saga, because I kind of hyped it up
yes,
already.
You did.
So we talked about the Phoenix Saga. My favorite saga of the Spider-Man animated series actually takes place in the first season. They call it the alien costume. It's a symbiote. So Venom, who is my favorite, hands down favorite Spider-Man villain of all time, is Venom. And so this was the way of introducing Venom by starting off. And I didn't know this. I thought Venom was like a standalone character that just kind of showed up. From this cartoon series, I learned that the reason Venom exists in the comics and in the show is because of Spider-Man encountering this black goop that basically took over his mind and made him super powerful, but also started making him crazy. And he realized, okay, I got to get away from this. And so the black goop ends up leaving Spider-Man and then bonding to this other guy, Eddie Brock, and turning him into Venom. And the reason he's got Spider-Man's powers is because he was attached to Spider-Man first. And that blew my mind.
First of all, he's from Queens. He stepped in some black goop. We've all stepped in black goop in Metro New York. He's nothing special. I kid. I liked it. I liked it too because it felt big. All three we talked about: Green Ranger, Phoenix, and Venom. All three of those are iconic in their own way. I think if you watch or liked only one of these three shows, but you knew about the other two, and you were like, "Oh, I hate Power Rangers," or "I hate X-Men," whatever it is. If you're not a hater, you can look at these three sagas and go, yeah, they were good. They brought something new and different to the table. Green Ranger was the first, in my opinion, in my lifetime as a child, live action, bad guys winning. Phoenix Saga was the first, well, she's good, now she's kind of bad, like, she changed. And then Venom was just like, holy God, like, he's an animal. Like,
he's nuts.
Everything was, they were all different and all brought something unique and different to the table. And Venom was just, to me, was the scariest of the three. As scary as a cartoon could be, but actually, if you looked at my notes, I talked about the action figures for Venom and the other types, like the other symbiotes. There were some creepy looking action figures they made when they expanded the Venom saga, so to speak.
Oh, yeah, because with Venom, you then had Carnage, another evil character that was a symbiote character, and he was really evil. Venom eventually kind of turned into sort of a good guy. Carnage is just plain evil. And then you've got all these other ones that I don't think they really feature them in the cartoon, but in the comics, the symbiote then bonds with so many other different people after this and just basically just
make some more action figures.
Makes more action figures for you to collect.
Exactly.
But it all started with Venom, and so will always be my favorite Spider-Man villain / anti-hero / ally, because there's video games that were tied to this animated series that had you fighting alongside Venom as a supporting character. So he was kind of a good guy, which I thought was kind of cool as well. He was kind of a good guy sometimes, kind of a bad guy, like just misguided, right? You wanted him to do right, but he didn't always do right because he wasn't always the most sensible guy.
He was not. But do you recall playing any of the Spider-Man video games?
Yes. So I was just going to say there was quite a few actually that came out even before the animated series that I actually did play on Nintendo, the original Nintendo. And then on the Sega Genesis, I played, it was called Spider-Man and Venom Separation Anxiety.
Never even heard of that.
You never heard of
No.
that game? Oh, it's so good. I'm pretty sure you have it on one of your systems, your emulators or whatever, because you need to play it. It's a beat 'em up game, so it's kind of a classic, left to right, beat up the bad guys game. But you play as Spider-Man or Venom, and you can play as, it's a 2-player game, and you just basically go through beating up the bad guys, and you fight, big Spider-Man villains at the end of every level. And I never beat it, so I don't really know who the big bad guy is at the end. I honestly don't know. They had another game that was, I don't know if you'd call it a sequel or just a different game in the series, but it was called Maximum Carnage. Do you remember that game?
I do remember that. And it's
Do you remember what was unique about that game?
It was a good game by LJN. That's what's unique about it.
Do you remember what else?
The cartridge was red.
It was red, and that was the coolest thing ever. And I remember that game was so hyped up. I remember seeing that hyped up in stores before it came out. And that's probably one of my earlier memories of like a game that was like hyped up, like, oh, this game is coming. I remember seeing it actually it's maybe not so much in the stores, but in comic books.
Yes.
Because I did have a few comic books or magazines where you had the ads for it. And I'm like, I don't know who this Carnage guy is, but he's scaring the crap out of me right now.
It was a very scary looking cover art, because I believe it was Carnage like over... Like, it was like his upper body, like his arms were spread like he was going to attack you. And like I believe it was like a city underneath him, and everything was red.
Yep. And it was just, just this monster looking guy that I'd never heard of at that point. That's how I first, heard about Carnage and everything like that. But I think in that game, you also play as Spider-Man or as Venom. So I don't know if it's considered a sequel to that other one or just a different game, kind of like you had the different Ninja Turtles games for Sega and Super Nintendo. Because it did come out on Sega Genesis alongside that other one. So I don't know where it fits into the the chronology or whatever. But remember liking it. Very hard game, but I really liked it. Honestly, I mean, the Spider-Man, I wasn't overly impressed with it, man. I'll be honest with you. If you're going to compare like X-Men games to Spider-Man games, I think X-Men had the better games.
I agree. For back in the day, they were certainly better.
Yeah. So, because there wasn't really a lot of, I mean, they didn't have a lot of Spider-Man games that I played like during that time period. They had games that came out later based on the movies and that new one that came out on PlayStation 4 a few years back, and those were great.
That PS4 game was really good.
Incredible. But the 90s, I mean, it was kind of bare bones as far as the stuff I played and that I got into. I mean, you had like probably the Game Gear game and stuff like that, but I never played
what also might contribute to this, we enjoyed the X-Men games more, or there were more games based on the X-Men, is the X-Men animated show had those silly blue and yellow outfits. So when you saw those in print, in a commercial, a video game, or an action figure, you knew it was affiliated with that era or that current time period. Spider-Man's outfit really didn't change. So you couldn't really tell, is this based on the comics, based on the show, based on just Spider-Man being Spider-Man? There wasn't that distinct connection to the show with the games and everything else, because the outfit was pretty much the same.
Well, honestly, I think Spider-Man in general has changed the least as far as in the comics. Like, you look at, like, if you were to watch the 90s cartoon, which, again, I very much enjoyed. I thought it was a great show. But you watch, look at Spider-Man, but also some of the villains, Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, Lizard. You look at them in the comics, and they basically look like that from when they came out in the 60s until that show came out 30 years later. They didn't really change much. Whereas X-Men, I think the characters evolved over time, and they really changed their look up a little bit more. And so, you can kind of pinpoint, depending on, like, if you were to look at a costume for Wolverine, you could probably pinpoint the decade in which that came out. Whereas Spider-Man, not so much.
No, not so much. I agree with you. And the same thing for Batman when we get to him. His outfit is reminiscent of what era that he's, currently in, or where that image or figure or whatever is from as well.
Right. And actually, I have the perfect segue from Spider-Man to Batman. You may not have thought this was possible, but I have a segue from a Marvel to a DC show. You ready for this?
Let's hear it.
Okay. So in Spider-Man, there was, you may not have realized this, a number of highfalutin celebrities that actually did guest spots on their show as voice actors. Did you know this?
I did not.
So, for example, J. Jonah Jameson, right? The head of the Daily Bugle, right? Total douche nozzle. He is voiced by none other than Ed Asner. Do you know who Ed Asner
Can't say
is?
I do.
So have you ever seen the movie Elf with
Yes,
Will
I
Ferrell?
have.
Do you know Santa Claus?
Oh.
That's Ed Asner, very famous. Now, people older than us will know him from the boss, I forget his name, from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. That's what he was originally kind of big for back in the day. Anyway, so Spider-Man had a lot of high-level celebrity voice actors that would come in and do guest spots. Mark Hamill actually voiced Hobgoblin. I don't know if you knew that or
I
not.
did know, because you could definitely hear that his voice there.
Yep. Who voices Joker in Batman. Now, it's funny because you look at somebody like Mark Hamill, and if you don't know, he's the guy who plays Luke Skywalker. But now, these days, honestly, he's probably more well-known for his voice acting work than Star Wars. Or maybe just as much. You don't think so?
He's Luke effing Skywalker, no matter what. It's Luke Skywalker. I don't think I don't think his voice acting is... I think it's revered as much as Luke Skywalker. I think, like, when you say, oh, Mark Hamill's Luke Skywalker and the Joker, it kind of goes hand in hand. But I think I think the average person just knows, well, did you know the guy that does Luke Skywalker also does the Joker? I would say over 50% don't know. Whereas everybody goes, hey, the guy that does Joker is also Luke Skywalker. Oh, yeah, I know that. So
that's fair. Well, my point being, and this was where the segue came in, is that the Batman animated series also had some highfalutin celebrity guest voice stars, and in the case of Mark Hamill, mainstream regular, or series regulars with the Joker. You had David Warner, who recently passed away. I don't know if you remember him. He was actually in the second Ninja Turtles movie as Professor Jordan Perry.
Is that the guy TGRI?
Yes,
we go.
He voiced Ra's al Ghul in the Batman animated series.
Okay.
See? Yep. So you had a lot of kind of guest voice actors that were like mainstream, movie actors that wanted to come on the show. So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. So we talked about Spider-Man, fantastic show. Talked about the toys, the games. Let's talk Batman, because to me, this is, as I mentioned, the top echelon of comic book based animated series. To this day, I think it's untouchable in terms of its quality, in terms of its rewatchability, and in terms of its overall story.
It certainly is. And the things that they tweaked and changed, they changed for the better, hands down.
And it's funny. So we talked about the kind of the runtime of, not runtime, but the show running of X-Men and Spider-Man. X-Men came in at 5 seasons, 75 episodes. Spider-Man also 5 seasons, 65 episodes. Batman the Animated Series, the original run, only 2 seasons between 92 and 95. But here's the funny thing, 85 episodes.
Yeah.
So they put out a lot more content in a much shorter time, which honestly, I think makes it more impactful as far as like my memories of watching it. Because I watched the other two and I remember watching them. I have vivid memories of where I was when I would watch this show, what time of day, because it was on so much and it was always a new episode.
Yeah, I remember it too. I didn't watch too much because in the early years, I was still in the Turtles. So if this was out in 92, I was still into them, and then after Turtles was Power Rangers, so those were the two big ones, but Batman, no pun intended, was kind of looming in the background.
No, I remember, so I actually started watching this pretty early on. I remember the commercials hyping it up too, because I was a huge fan of the Tim Burton Batman movies. Actually, I take it back. I'd only seen Batman Returns. I'd never seen the original with Jack Nicholson as the Joker at this point. But I knew Batman from Batman Returns, and I had some Batman toys, obviously. So I was very excited for Batman. So when it came on, and I remember this because it came on every day at 4:30 in the afternoon on Fox 23. And I know this because I would watch it right before dinner time, and we always had dinner at 5 o'clock at my house. Whatever my mom was cooking, it was ready by 5. And so I would sit at the kitchen counter watching I'm trying to picture the TV size in my head. If it was 10 inches, that was a big screen. It was not a big screen. It was one of those older TVs that you had to always bop on the top because it was getting staticky. The antenna was broken.
I was going to say, was it a turn dial?
It was a turn dial, but the knob fell off, so we had to use pliers.
I had to use
change
those
the channel.
too back in the day.
So, like I said, vivid because there were so many episodes and I was so excited for it. So again, I watched that every day at 4:30, and we were allowed to sit there and watch it until dinner was ready, which usually was around 5 o'clock. So that's how I knew it came on. It was between 4 and 4:30 that it came on. I can't remember which one. But let me ask you, total side note, and I don't know why I'm thinking of this. It's a TV question because I want to know if you had this happen to your TV too.
Okay.
Did your mom ever run like a power tool, not a power tool, but like a power plant, like a blender or mixer while you were watching TV?
Yes, and you would get the,
you remember
you would get the fuzz on it.
You'd get the fuzz.
Yes.
Why?
Hair dryer. My mom would have a hair dryer going, and
it would make the TV fuzz up.
I don't know why.
That's so weird. No. Oh my God. Okay. So it's not just me. Again, that's what this podcast is about. Shared experiences that you did not know were shared with other people. So my wife is a former science teacher. I'm going to go ask her why that happened. Surely she's got some kind of answer for me.
Sure. I think an electrician might be better, but why not?
Hey, I've got the science teacher in the house, man. We'll
start there.
And we'll work our way
yes,
up.
Because the electrician might charge you for that question.
Well, exactly. See, and she's she's free. Well, anyway. All right. So again, 2 seasons, but so many episodes. Loved the show. And it really did. I think it was intentionally done this way, but a continuation of that Tim Burton series because the music was very similar to those Batman movies. The villains in some ways looked very similar. The only way it wasn't a continuation is because the villains that were in the show that were in the movies died in the movies. So obviously they're, it's different. But it just felt, it was dark and it was a perfect embodiment of Batman, which as an adult going back and rewatching it, I appreciate even more because I have a better appreciation for the comics and just kind of the origins of Batman and how it came to be and the legacy really being an almost 90-year-old, property at this point.
I remember watching it, liking it, not loving it, but liking it, had the toys, watched it. When the Arkham games came out in like 2009, 10-ish, yeah, it was voiced by Kevin Conroy, who was Batman in the animated series, and did a couple of the follow-up series as well, and Mark Hamill as well in the game. And in the Arkham games, I remember the second one, Arkham City, they said, oh, this is probably the second best representation of Mr. Freeze other than Batman the Animated Series. And I go, well, I remember watching it, but what's the deal with that? So I had to do a little digging. Back in the day, apparently Mr. Freeze was kind of like a Johnny-come-lately back in the old Adam West shows.
Yeah.
Closer to what Schwarzenegger played. Chill. Relax. We'll kill the dinosaurs. The Ice Age. That stuff. The animated show completely redid that character. So like we said before, loyal to the source material, but they didn't tweak things. Like X-Men and Spiderman kind of kept everybody the same. Batman the Animated Series took a character that nobody cared about and redid him. Did you watch that Mr. Freeze episode? Do you have any recollection? Any memories of it? Do you recall anything from it?
I'm going to be honest. No, I know that it's very well revered. I think it won an Emmy.
It did
because it's Heart of Ice was the name of the. Was it a 2-parter even, or was it just one?
I think it was one, but man, it's looking at it as an adult. You have to know where that character was before this episode aired. He was nothing. Nobody cared about him, and then the writing of it. And the context of it, that you could see that he's a villain, but he's kind of suffering. There were elements of that in the live action with Schwarzenegger, that he's trying to save his wife. Is he good? Is he bad? Things of that nature. But that was the tone of the show, was like, it was deeper than just, I'm good, you're bad.
Yeah.
And it also introduced Harley Quinn.
Yes, Harley Quinn, who, even my wife knows who Harley Quinn is at this point. That's how famous she is. And it's because she was introduced in this series. And I was going to say, because we talked about how like X-Men stuck to the comics, Spider-Man pretty much stuck to the comics. Batman, I don't think did, but I also feel like there's been so many different interpretations of Batman at this point that it's okay. Like this is up there with all the other different versions of different characters, and I'm fine with that. Because like you said, it's because of this show that we have certain characters, but also certain versions of characters that have kind of carried over however many years later now. So that's how good this show was and is. It really does hold up. If you can watch it, I think it's streaming on HBO Max at this point, but you can buy the DVDs. You can also buy, the digital episodes as well. It is a fantastic show. Like, if you have any interest in Batman whatsoever, this has got to be up there. And another thing too, I was just thinking about this. I think another reason why Batman, the animated series, has held up so well and is so kind of, I have such fond memories of it, is because we also, during that time period, think about this, when that show was out, we also got like 2 or 3 Batman movies at the same time. So Batman was like out there, man. Whereas X-Men and Spider-Man, I mean, you had to wait 10 years or almost before you got, a live action version of those characters. Whereas Batman, you had it. So, I mean, Batman was everywhere, whether it was a live action movie or a cartoon show or a video game or toys. I mean, he really stood the test of time, and he was everywhere at that point.
It's very true. He was everywhere. And actually, while you were doing that, I actually picked up the DVD of the first season of Batman the Animated Series and was looking at the back of it because it reminded me of another episode that was very good. But what really struck me was it has, obviously, the runtime, DCComics.com, America Online keyword DC Comics.
Oh, nice.
So I'm like, how old is this? When was this made? 2004. So to me, that means this was among one of the first, and I had no knowledge of this, was probably one of the first shows from our generation of being kids that they put on DVD.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense.
Because it has AOL keyword.
Yeah.
Which could be another episode.
Oh, and I was going to say, trust me, we're going to do an episode on AOL.
Yes.
Because that was a big part of it.
But that's saying how popular that show was, that, there's this new medium of DVDs, and we could take an entire series or entire seasons and put them out. And Batman was made in 2004, whereas I had to wait till 2009 to get the Ghostbusters. I had to wait 5 more years.
I think it's, compared to any of the other animated superhero shows from that era, it's one of the few that, like, you can't be like, oh, hey, remember this hidden gem of a show? Because it evolved into, an animated series that's kind of still going today with the Justice League and whatnot. It started because of this series, and so it really hasn't gone away. Whereas X-Men, I mean, you had, the thing was X-Men, you had different variations of the X-Men come out over the years, and so up until now, where you've now got that sequel series coming out on Disney Plus, it kind of went back in the vault, and that was it. And again, much like Batman, it came out on DVD eventually, but it's one of those where, I mean, it was gone, and like, you would see reruns for a couple of years, but that was it. And so whereas Batman the Animated Series has continued through different spin-off shows, but you can very easily trace it back to when it came out. I mean, God, it's 30 years ago, Lou, the show came out. It's insane, and it's still,
That's disgusting.
It holds up.
That's disgusting.
I don't know about disgusting. I think it's remarkable.
I mean, it is remarkable, but I just wasn't prepared to hear that the show was 30 years old.
30 years old, and it's great. It's a fantastic show.
It is.
Again, it's probably my favorite animated superhero cartoon of all time.
As an adult, it certainly is. One more episode I want to bring up about it. If you've seen it, obviously let me know what you thought about it. If not, I would highly suggest this one too, is the Two-Face episode.
Yes. Oh, I was going to say that was one of the first ones I watched.
Yes, and they made it... I'm going to jump back to Power Rangers again for a second, and hopefully people are not mad at me for doing this. They introduced Tommy the Green Ranger literally in the beginning of the saga. So you kind of knew something was up with him.
Yep.
With this, they had Harvey Dent as a recurring character in a kids show for a few episodes, maybe even more. But he was just a character, and they built and they built and they built and they built, and then boom, it happened. So it was like, here's a new character, and in this episode, he's going to turn into Two-Face, or the next episode, he's going to turn into Two-Face, or we're going to tease it, and then the next episode. No, he was just a regular character. So it was a cartoon, but it goes to when I said in a previous episode, to me, there's a difference between a cartoon and an animated show.
Yeah.
This is an animated show. Star Wars Clone Wars is an animated show. All of these are animated shows. Whereas the things on Nickelodeon back in the day were cartoons.
For kids. Just for kids. That was the thing. It was they were kids shows. Whereas these were enjoyed by, I mean, pretty much people of all ages, especially fans of the comics.
I'm still enjoying them. I mean, I rented a animated Batman movie. What was it? I think it was The Long Halloween, and it's new. It just came out, and then in that DVD they had those Two-Face episodes. That's why they're so fresh in my mind. So, the animated show led the way for all these DC animated movies that they make, which are, to me, above and beyond the movies they actually produce because they're loyal to the source material. But, man, this show is just fantastic. As an adult, it's my favorite. Back in the day, it was not. But looking at it through different glasses, so to speak, now, it's the best.
So I'm gonna ask you this before we go on to kind of our honorable mentions for some of the other shows that had come out at this time. So comparing X-Men, Spider-Man, and Batman on the villain side, because I was just thinking about this.
That's tough.
So who would you say? Well, I was going to ask you. So which of the three, which ones had the best villains for the superheroes, for the good guys to fight against?
In the show or in general? We're talking
about the shows specifically, not the comics or the movies. Within these shows, which franchise had the best villains in your opinion?
Wow. That's really, really hard. As an adult, it's definitely Batman.
Okay.
Because, like we said, with Two-Face, with Mr. Freeze, and also that iconic Jingle Bells, Batman Smells Robin Laid an Egg, that's from the animated series.
That's right. And we sang that in kindergarten class. Yeah. Like, in music class, our teacher let us sing it at Christmas time. It was the coolest.
I think you have to say, I don't want to say you have to think. I say Batman based on two things. Mr. Freeze.
Okay.
They didn't create that character, but boy, did they reinvent that character. And they did.
They perfected it.
Yes, and they did create Harley Quinn. I don't think, and she's a pop culture icon at this point.
Yes.
I would say she's almost, dare I say, like in the world of pop culture, as big as, maybe even bigger than the Joker. I know it's a bold statement, but I go to Comic-Con in New York City every year. I cannot tell you how many people I see dressed as Harley Quinn.
I think as far as like mainstream at this point, yes.
Yes.
I think she's definitely crossed over. She's got her own series on HBO, an animated series. I don't know if you knew that.
And she's
apparently it's very good, though.
And they just, as we're recording this, they did announce Joker 2, the second Joker movie. Do you know who's playing her?
Lady Gaga.
Yes.
I did hear about that. That's very exciting, actually. So yeah, okay, that's fair.
Well,
so,
what do you think about the characters?
Well, and I'm gonna tell you this. So, as a whole, of all the superheroes that are out there, I think Batman has the best villains, hands down. Like, absolutely my favorite villains, hands down. However, in the case of these three animated series, I'm going to go with Spider-Man as having the best villains for the series. Not because they're the best written, or because they are the most complex or complicated or deep. I think Batman wins in those categories. But as a kid, I think they had the coolest looks. I think they had the coolest toys. And I think it was one where they all kind of felt unique. Whereas Batman, everything always felt kind of dark. The Spider-Man villains all really kind of had their unique powers, unique backgrounds. That was the other thing too, is a lot of the Batman villains were just normal people that had some kind of maybe a deformity, or they were just, but they didn't have powers, right? Spider-Man was fantastical. You had Dr. Octopus with these robot arms. You had the Lizard, who was, well, he was a lizard. You had Hobgoblin and Green Goblin with this cool glider, and he threw bombs, and so you had these kind of fantastical elements. So in my opinion, as a kid, I think Spider-Man had the best villains. But I do want to stress that overall, and especially as an adult, I think looking back at the villains, the rogues gallery, if you were, I think Batman wins hands down.
It sounds like another top 10 list.
Let's do it. penciling it down.
Okay.
Now. Top
Good.
10 villains. There we go. All right. So before we wrap up, let's give a few honorable mentions because I knew there was a couple of other animated shows during this time period. I did not realize how many until I got Disney Plus and saw that they released actually quite a few, Lou. You wrote them down. I didn't write them down here. You want to just go through the list of the other animated superhero series that apparently were around at this time in the 90s?
Yeah, I was in the same boat. I got Disney Plus, and truth be told, the first thing I watched on Disney Plus was the animated Spider-Man. That was the first thing, because I had the X-Men on DVD. I had Batman on DVD. I don't think they made Spider-Man, or I couldn't find it. That was literally the first thing I watched. That's another good theme song, too. But yeah, Disney Plus does have these plethora of animated shows. They have Iron Man, they have Fantastic Four, they have the Hulk, they even have Silver Surfer. Talk about bad video games. That's a bad video game for the original Nintendo. Very frustrating. So I'd never watched those back in the day. I didn't even know they existed. So that cross platform, that's video game talk, cross promotion almost of like the shows, it didn't work for me because I didn't know they existed. But they were also B-list. I would even say Silver Surfer's a C-list superhero. I didn't know they existed. I watched a little bit on Disney Plus. Did you?
I did actually. I started with the X-Men animated series because I don't own that one on DVD, and so I was very curious to pick that one up. And again, it still holds up. But you're right. I want to make a point again. So Iron Man, Hulk, Fantastic Four, these were B-list superheroes back in the 90s. Nobody cared about them, and so I think that's why they weren't as popular as far as animated series. The only one that I maybe remember watching is probably Fantastic Four, because they also appeared in the Spider-Man animated series, and I think Iron Man did too. But again, I didn't really care about Iron Man at the time.
I think Captain America also appeared at the end of the X-Men also.
Okay, and I know he appeared at the end of Spider-Man too. So, but he never got his own animated series, as far as I know, as far as from the 90s. So he only showed up in these other ones. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's just because they didn't have that mainstream appeal. There's a reason that X-Men and Spider-Man were the first Marvel superhero movies to get, live action releases in the early 2000s, is because they were so popular in the 90s, whereas these other properties that no studio wanted, it took a little longer to get those movies, but we got them.
So now I'm going to blow your mind.
Okay.
So we're talking about the 90s, X-Men, Spider-Man, those are the ones.
Yep.
Now you're a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old. Is it reversed? Do they view the X-Men as that other weird thing that's not in the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I as I say, I could ask my son who's 4.
I think he's too young. I think we got to ask somebody that's around.
I mean, he's not that he's too young, but more so because of the fact that I grew up with it. It's in our house still. Like I think I've mentioned this before. He's got like an X-Men arcade game upstairs in his playroom that has the 90s X-Men on there. So he knows X-Men characters. He has X-Men action figures. Mm-hmm. So to him, I think they're on the same level as some of these other characters. Probably not as much as like the core Avengers, obviously, but, or Spider-Man. But I mean, he knows who they are. So if you were to ask a random 8 to 10-year-old who like all they know for Marvel is the Disney stuff, I mean, you're right. Maybe not. Maybe they don't really know who the X-Men are. If they do, they're kind of the weird ones. Whereas, their heyday was, again, almost 30 years ago. But making a comeback. And I think once they get into the Marvel Cinematic Universe as far as live action goes and they bring the X-Men in finally, I think it'll kind of restart the love for X-Men and the mainstream appeal for them.
It's funny you mentioned that, bringing them into the mainstream. Did you see the newest Doctor Strange movie?
I have not.
You know what's in it, right?
I know some spoilers. I'm not going to spoil a movie on this podcast.
All right, we won't spoil it, but it involves one of these shows.
Yes.
In great detail. Like, not even like open to interpretation. Like, nope, that person is from one of these shows because the way was drawn up is his physical appearance in this movie.
Yes.
That's laying the groundwork.
Much I did know. Yes. And that's all again, we're not going to spoil any movies on here. We're not that kind of podcast.
It's a good movie, though. I highly recommend it.
It's on my list to watch for sure. So awesome. All right, man. Well, listen, let's wrap it up here. So this was a lot of fun. Again, I didn't think we necessarily had enough to, I mean, who knows, maybe we did, enough to talk about for a full hour for each of these shows individually, but I think this trifecta of cartoons, really, I mean, for me personally, I don't think we would have any superhero movies now without these cartoons, at least Marvel movies. Batman, I think, would have been fine. But the Marvel movies, I think we owe a big part of that to the success of these cartoons. And then, on top of that, just the fact that they're so beloved, they're coming back, they're remaking, or excuse me, sorry, they're continuing the series as far as X-Men goes. They're continuing to make new Spider-Man series. I mean, the Marvel universe as we know it now owes so much of its existence to due to the success of these series.
I agree. I think the MCU is because of this show. I'm talking about the X-Men, excuse me. The X-Men show made the X-Men movie, and then the X-Men movies made Iron Man. And if Robert Downey Jr. did not nail that role, none of this. That's how I view it. Yeah. Animated show to the X-Men movie to Downey doing Iron Man.
Yeah. Well, and don't forget about the live action Spider-Man movies too.
Yes. I think the cartoon, animated Spider-Man led to those movies. But I feel like the X-Men tried to make it a bigger universe, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know. I agree that the Spider-Man animated show led to the Tobey Maguire movies, which were fantastic.
Yeah. So, but anyway, no, very clear to see the long-lasting impact that all three of these shows have had on their respective properties and honestly on pop culture in general, which I think is really cool. And again, the fact that now we can go into stores and see a lot of this stuff out there again, because it's been 30 years almost. We're now seeing, this series of X-Men and Spider-Man and on t-shirts and like they re-released the toys and things like that because we have disposable income in theory at this stage of our lives to go out there and relive our childhoods, which again is what this podcast is all about. So Lou, once again, it's good to have you back, man. We took a break. We had a few other guests in between, but it's good to have you back on the show.
Always good to be back. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so we'll get together again soon. We'll figure out what we're going to talk about. Thank you guys again so much for listening to another episode of Generation S. And hey, don't forget, make sure you leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever it is you listen to this podcast. And don't forget to check us out on Facebook as well. It's Generation S Podcast. Give that a like and check out the posts we make there. We usually post some pretty relevant stuff to wherever the topic is going to be that we're putting out that week. And once again, Lou, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. And I have to confess one thing before I go.
What's that?
My Marvel crush was Psylocke and my DC crush was Poison Ivy. Thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.